Okay, so all jokes aside, microtransactions, loot boxes, all these things they really have been hammered home, talked about for the last week. And I want to start by saying I don't know what the solution is really either. So what is the issue here? Just let's back up, because I've had a long time to think about this over the last week, and honestly, since I started seeing it, I've thought about it kind of off and on. What's up with microtransactions? And more specifically, what's up with loot boxes? Recently, the ESRB said that it does not consider loot boxes to be gambling. That's an interesting statement, and it is one with logic behind it. Whether it's flawed logic or not, I'll let you decide. I have my opinion on it that I'm sure I'll share here too. But what I do want to look at is why microtransactions are happening so frequently now in all these games. And it's not just mobile games. It's not where it started with, these free-to-play mobile games where it'd be like, oh, recharge your energy gauge for 25 cents or this or that. Skip 5 hours of building your fort on this game. $1, all that stuff. That's kind of where we originally saw these things. And it was annoying, but not really a problem. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Who plays games on their phone? Lots of people play games on their phone. But what I mean is, gamer culture, it's not really the same as the mobile gaming culture. They're somewhat separated. People were willing to look the other way on it. They didn't care. You were getting access to something for free, and then after a certain point it would kind of lock off and you would pay for it if you wanted to keep playing it. So that's not really the issue here. The problem is when these practices started permeating into AAA $60 console and PC games. And they're not always even just in AAA games, but that's where we see it the most. That's where it's becoming the biggest problem. I remember it was a big deal a couple years back when it was working its way into Assassin's Creed, and now it's just everywhere. One of the biggest new things that drew, well, there were two big new things that drew the ire of consumers on microtransactions, and that was what was going on with Shadow of War and the loot box system, and the Star Wars Battlefront 2 beta, and how there were already microtransactions permeating this beta, and it was kind of being implied that if you wanted to progress and have a good star card layout, you were going to likely have to pay for it. Now, there's two different ways to look at this. One is, would I rather have more expensive games and have no microtransactions? And that is where I actually fall myself. Like, I would rather bump the price of games $20, $20, $30, pay more for them, and not have this. Or do we keep it at 60 and make these games a service? It's an interesting argument, because if you do make it a service and you do keep the price at 60, I guess you can get more games. Whether or not you have the time to play through all those games anyway, or you're just wasting that money regardless, is another issue, depending on who you are, what your life situation is. But there's a lot of articles I've been reading about this entire thing that I find very interesting. Now, recently, neowin.net, they did a news article. Microtransactions make the game industry a ton of money, tripling its value. And by the way, like always when I reference these articles, we're going to be leaving these down below in the description. During the course of this article, they were talking about why microtransactions have permeated so deeply into games, especially these AAA premium titles. And they cited another article, which was published by e-commerce company Digital River. And this article claimed that a quarter of all digital revenue from PC games with an upfront cost came from additional content. That was in 2016. And that not only freemium games, but also AAA premium titles that, that people are already paying up for, or paying up front for. That was included in that. It wasn't just freemium stuff. And in this report, Defend Your Kingdom, What Game Publishers Need to Know About Monetization and Fraud. This is a direct quote from that article that they were citing. Consumers are less willing to pay $60 for a boxed game, and instead choose titles with a steady stream of new content. Publishers seek to meet these expectations and have adopted a games-as-a-service model, releasing fewer titles over time while keeping players engaged longer with regular updates and add-ons. End quote. So here's the thing. I don't actually think that is a big problem in the way that it was cited there, because I do think there's a difference between doing updates and add-ons. I think that's a difference than microtransactions. So normal DLC, you wouldn't always consider this to be a microtransaction. Jeez, my allergies are killing me this year. It is making talking tough. Let's look at what Bethesda has always done. If you look at things like Skyrim, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, and Oblivion, these massive DLC updates with hours and hours and hours of content that ranged between $15 and $20, these were not seen as microtransactions, they were just seen as buying DLC. I personally do think that that's the case. Like, I see that type of purchase differently from something like pay, $1 and get this loot box with these random orcs in it for your Uruk army for Shadow of War, or you could get random star cards for Battlefront 2. Those are different to me than just normal DLC. And I think a lot of gamers see it that way. So games as a service is not always a bad thing, if you're looking at it that way. You're going to hear me clicking around to get to my articles. However, I do think it's bad when you start hinting things that will give people advantages, like buy these random star cards, or even things that completely defeat the point of the game. So we look at Shadow of War, and this is why it's been such a big deal. This is a single-player only game. Yes, now there is some online functionality with like going into people's strongholds, beating their orcs, beating their army. Doesn't affect their progress in their game, but then you unlock valuables in your game from doing that. It's like leaderboards, but like interactive, and you're going in and doing a thing and getting a reward. It reminded me a little bit of Rival Points. I believe that's what they were called, from Arkham Knight. It's just like this weird way to add a multiplayer to a game that doesn't need it, but that's fine, right? But the issue is that you can pay money to get orcs that affect your game and defeat the purpose of your game by just making an army out of your wallet instead of making an army out of playing the game. And then you can also use those orcs to give your strongholds an advantage, so players have a harder time going in and beating them on their own through work. So there are issues here with microtransactions because they often give players an edge, or they just defeat the purpose of what the game is. You take the army building out of Shadow of War, you're left with a good story still, and that's coming from somebody who's usually critical of game stories. It is good, but you're defeating the main purpose of the game, building an army, which I think is really too bad. But basically, also in that same article, it was cited that microtransactions have pretty much tripled the value of the games industry because it's bringing in so much more money. That's why we're still seeing so much of it. That's why it's been increasing. It's in Destiny 2 as well. and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. The ESRB, which had a chance to weigh in here and basically call this gambling, these types of loot boxes, putting real money down to get random items that may or may not be, you know, actually useful or not, they said it's not gambling. And they also they reasoned this out. This is from an article from Kotaku, and it's the ESRB says it doesn't see loot boxes as gambling, very aptly and to the point named. They basically said that this is because you're always guaranteed to receive in-game content even if you don't want what you get. And the spokesperson also added that any game with real gambling will always receive an adults-only rating, which this is the part that I have a problem with. Well, no, I mean, I had a problem with the whole thing, don't get me wrong, but I have a problem with the ESRB weighing in on this in this way because gaming has always been pretty self-regulated by the ESRB. It was set up voluntarily by game companies. Specifically, Sega had pushed its own... Before the ESRB, Sega had pushed its own video game rating system beforehand. And it kind of started... It's so hard to explain the history of the ESRB, but 3DO is a part of it. Sega still has a hand in it. There's like all of these games, like game people and companies that have a hand in the ESRB. And so it's always been a little bit contested whether or not it has a vested interest in the gaming industry. And I'm not here to say that it does. Like, this isn't a takedown piece on the ESRB. I think the ESRB is likely a much better solution than having the government censor or control what we can do. Because as soon as you have people change who's in power, things change. A good example of this, while taking a politically neutral stance myself, because I don't really like to get super into that on the channel unless it's, you know, really necessary. But like, let's look at the last administration with the FCC and how we got net neutrality, right? And now this administration with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, you have more of a push away from net neutrality, siding a little bit more with the companies that control the internet in America, right? That is basically what happens when you give the government control over an industry, or when you give the government the ability to make more laws on an industry. You have the issue of what happens when the next guy comes into power with that government branch or that government agency. And this is just one example. Obviously, there's been plenty of places that it's gone right, and the FCC is not a terrible company. But it's not a company. It's not a terrible group. I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying that when you have hands of power change, sometimes policies can change, stances on policies can change, and then you're stuck with a bunch of companies that have to adapt to the new guy. And so that's why people have always liked the ESRB. It's been very self-regulatory. We haven't had to worry about the government stepping in. The issue is, if the ESRB does have a vested interest in gaming, because, you know, Acclaim, Electronic Arts, Nintendo, and Sega, they had created the Interactive Digital Software Association in 1994, and then Sega proposed, by the way, now I'm reading off of Wikipedia because it's just easier to explain it this way. Sega proposed that the industry use its VRC rating system it had made. Nintendo objected to that idea, and then instead a vendor-neutral rating system known as the ESRB was developed. And there is an ESRB board still, with the lowest rating being early childhood and the highest being adults only. Now, why would it be a problem if these loot boxes were declared gambling? Like real-world gambling? Well, the ESRB basically says that if a game is rated as having real-world gambling in it, it has to be rated adults only, Once it's rated adults only, it's not going to be carried by mainstream vendors, which is going to kill that game and kill business for those companies that have those practices in them. And also, that's going to hurt the gaming industry as a whole because it's going to really diminish the amount of money coming in. Because right now, there's a lot of money coming in, a lot, from these purchases. And there's been some issues with Take-Two having a hand in the ESRB, specifically ESRB chairman Strauss Zelnick, who's the CEO of Take-Two, or one of them. This stuff is all really complicated. And he's on the ESRB chair. It's so hard to tell, you know, like, where the objectivity takes place and where the vested interest might lie, if you even want to say there is one. And for me, it's such a hard and complicated thing to look at because the whole point of keeping the government out of this was to keep politics out of gaming. It was to basically make it so that the government couldn't just come in, censor gaming, or cut out violence because it just didn't want it in there. And that's why the ESRB was formed. So now if we're looking at this and the ESRB might be promoting a anti-consumer model of gaming, it's really frustrating to me because I'm not sure if that's, you know, I'm not really sure if that's what's going on. Is the ESRB doing this on purpose? Do they actually believe what they're saying? Is it protecting the pocketbooks of the companies involved in the ratings board? That's what I'm personally concerned about going forward. And I know I've taken a lot of time to try to explain this stuff and get deep into it. I mean, this was really long. It's probably the longest rant I've done on this channel. But I really did want to provide some background into some of these things. It is so much deeper than I've even given you the background to. I really want you guys, if you have the time, to look at some of these articles, look into the history of the ESRB, look at microtransactions in games today, and just think about it. That's really what you got to do. Because I don't want to sound like a huge hypocrite. I have bought in microtransactions before. I've always kept it to a minimum. I've never spent much on them at all, and there's very few games that I've spent the money on for them. But I do think it's worth remembering that the reason that these things still happen is because we pay for them. And we're adults. We can pay for these things clearly. But there are vulnerable adults out there that I don't want to say these game companies are preying on them, but I would say that it's about the same as for some people, like kids and vulnerable adults. This is the same as if you took a vulnerable adult with a disorder, like a mental disorder, and you just kind of tossed him into a casino in Vegas, you know? Yes, he can make his own decisions, but are they informed decisions? At what point does someone intervene with this type of thing? And even ignoring that hypothetical, is this just being harmful to game design in general? Is it hurting games? Obviously not the pocketbooks, but is it making games worse? And is it frankly sucking the fun out of a pastime that is designed to distract us and be a fun escape? I'm really interested in your guys' opinion on this. As you can tell from my tone and from the video, I have my own opinion on it, but I'm also a little conflicted. I'm not really sure what can be done about it at this point, and I don't know where to go from here. Because I know that for me, since these practices have started really seeping into games, I've bought less of them. And it's too bad to see some of the big players in the gaming industry really just cashing in for a quick payday and alienating the consumer in the process. Anyway, guys, this has been Jay. I appreciate you guys sticking this one out with me. I know it's longer. If you like the content, please like the video and subscribe for more like it. I'll be seeing you in the next one. Peace.